Cairo, a city of minarets and markets, of empires and revolutions. A place where ancient stone and restless humanity have shared the same narrow streets for more than 1,000 years. Pharaohs imagined the world that came before it. Caliphs built it. Sultans fortified it. Scholars filled it with knowledge. Conquerors marched through it. Revolutionaries shook it. And every generation left another layer upon the last. Through it all, the people of Cairo endured, resourceful, resilient, fiercely proud, and almost impossible to separate from the river that gave the city life. The Nile has always been more than water here. It is the rhythm beneath every kingdom, every dynasty, every triumph, and every collapse. For centuries, we've relied on faded manuscripts, weathered paintings, forgotten maps, and travelers' descriptions to imagine what Cairo once looked like. But now, using advanced AI trained on authentic historical imagery, we're able to breathe new life into those lost worlds. Ancient streets become crowded once more. Forgotten palaces rise again. Bustling markets echo with voices that fell silent centuries ago. The distance between past and present begins to disappear. From a windswept landscape beside the Nile long before Cairo even existed, to the glittering skyline, crowded bridges, and endless sea of lights that define the modern Egyptian capital today. This is the complete story of one of the most influential cities ever built. A city that witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, survived invasions, plagues, civil wars, occupations, and revolutions. A city that became the intellectual heart of the Islamic world, the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, and the home of millions whose lives continue to shape its story every single day. This is the entire history of Cairo. Let's begin at the beginning. Long before Cairo existed, before the first mosque, before the first minaret pierced the skyline, and before anyone imagined a city here, this stretch of the Nile was already one of the most valuable pieces of land on Earth. People had been living along these riverbanks for thousands of years. By around 3100 BC, when Upper and Lower Egypt were united under the first pharaohs, settlements clustered wherever the Nile's annual floods left behind rich black soil. Life revolved around the river. It carried grain, people, armies, and ideas. Without it, Egypt simply could not exist. The area where Cairo now stands wasn't yet a great city. Instead, it lay just north of one of ancient Egypt's most important centers, Memphis. Founded around 3000 BC, likely by King Narmer, whom many historians credit with unifying Egypt, Memphis became the first great capital of the Egyptian state. Positioned near the point where the Nile Delta begins to spread toward the Mediterranean, it controlled traffic moving between Upper and Lower Egypt. Geography made it powerful long before walls or armies did. For centuries, Memphis flourished. Vast temples rose from the floodplain. Royal palaces overlooked busy harbors filled with barges carrying stone from the south, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, and grain destined for every corner of the kingdom. Nearby, the enormous pyramids of Giza, Saqqara, and Dashur transformed the western horizon into perhaps the greatest monumental landscape ever created by human hands. But history rarely leaves capitals untouched. As Egypt passed from the hands of native dynasties to Persians, then to the armies of Alexander the Great in 332 BC, power gradually shifted north toward the new Mediterranean city of Alexandria. Memphis remained wealthy and sacred, but it was no longer the unquestioned heart of Egypt. Then, in 30 BC, another empire arrived. After the defeat of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, Egypt became a province of Rome. Roman administrators strengthened the settlements along the Nile, expanded roads and river transport, and transformed Egypt into one of the empire's greatest suppliers of grain. The future site of Cairo grew steadily more important, not yet as a capital, but as the strategic gateway connecting the Nile Valley, the Delta, and the routes leading east toward the Red Sea. The city called Cairo still did not exist, but the stage on which it would one day rise was finally being built. By the 4th century AD, Roman Egypt was changing. The old pharaonic temples were fading. Christianity was spreading rapidly across the Nile Valley. The Roman Empire itself was beginning to fracture under the weight of invasions, civil wars, and political instability. Egypt remained enormously valuable, Its grain still helped feed the empire, but protecting it had become harder than ever. The Roman answer was not another pyramid or another palace. It was a fortress. Around AD 300, during the reign of Emperor Diocletian, Roman engineers constructed one of the largest military fortresses in the Eastern Empire on the east bank of the Nile. Known today as the Fortress of Babylon, its massive stone walls, towers, and gates guarded the crossing between Lower and Upper Egypt and controlled the canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea. It was an extraordinary position. Anyone wishing to control Egypt's heartland would eventually have to pass this point. The fortress quickly became more than a military base. Merchants settled around its walls. Churches appeared as Christianity flourished throughout Egypt. Craftsmen, sailors, officials, and farmers built homes in its shadow. A permanent community was taking shape where armies had first dug foundations. Then came one of history's greatest turning points. In AD 639, an Arab army led by the brilliant general Imar ibn al-As crossed into Egypt from the Sinai Peninsula. Compared with the vast Roman Empire, the invading force was surprisingly small, perhaps only a few thousand men at first. But they moved with remarkable speed and discipline. Their greatest obstacle stood directly ahead: the fortress of Babylon. For months, the defenders held out behind towering Roman walls. Siege engines battered the defenses. Skirmishes erupted outside the gates. Neither side could force a decisive breakthrough. The outcome would determine not only the fate of one fortress, but of Egypt itself. Finally, after months of fighting, the Byzantine garrison surrendered in AD 641. The victory transformed the entire region. Instead of restoring Roman rule, Amr ibn al-As made a decision that would change history. Rather than governing from ancient Memphis or distant Alexandria, he established a new settlement immediately beside the conquered fortress. It was called Fustat. For the first time, the foundations of the city that would one day become Cairo had been laid. The age of the pharaohs and the Romans was over. The age of Islamic Egypt had begun. The city that Amr ibn al-As founded did not remain alone for long. Over the next 3 centuries, new rulers arrived from Baghdad, each building their own administrative settlements beside Fustat rather than inside it. Al-Askar appeared under the Abbasids. Then came Al-Qadai, the magnificent capital of the Tulunid dynasty, complete with vast palaces and the great mosque of Ibn Tulun, which still stands today. Then, in AD 969, another army arrived. The Fatimids swept into Egypt from North Africa under the general Jawhar al-Sakili. Unlike earlier conquerors, they didn't simply occupy the existing cities. They built an entirely new one. Just north of Fustat rose Al-Qahira, the victorious, the city that would eventually become Cairo. At first, it wasn't a city for ordinary people. It was an enormous royal enclosure reserved for the Fatimid Caliph, his court, his soldiers, and his government. Massive walls enclosed glittering palaces, ceremonial squares, gardens, and, in AD 970, construction began on Al-Azhar Mosque, an institution that would grow into one of the oldest continuously operating centers of learning in the world. It looked as though Cairo's future would be one of uninterrupted greatness. Instead, disaster arrived. Beginning in 1065, Egypt suffered one of the worst famines in its recorded history. For 7 devastating years, the Nile failed to flood properly. Harvests collapsed. Food prices exploded beyond imagination. Contemporary chroniclers describe entire neighborhoods abandoned, government officials unable to collect taxes, and desperate families selling everything they owned simply to survive. Some accounts even speak of widespread starvation so severe that society itself began to unravel. The Fatimid state nearly collapsed. Before the city could fully recover, another threat appeared. The Crusades had engulfed the eastern Mediterranean. In 1168, fearing that the Crusaders were about to seize Egypt, the Fatimid vizier Shawar made one of the most extraordinary decisions in medieval history. He ordered his own capital burned. For more than 50 days, flames consumed Fustat. Warehouses, homes, markets, workshops, and centuries of history disappeared beneath towering columns of smoke. Better to destroy the city, Shawar believed, than allow it to fall intact into enemy hands. The gamble failed. Within a year, the Fatimid dynasty itself was gone. But from the ashes emerged a new ruler named Saladin. And under him, Cairo was about to become the greatest fortress in the Islamic world. By the early 1170s, Egypt was exhausted. The Fatimid Caliphate had collapsed after more than 2 centuries of rule. Famine had crippled the economy. Fustat lay in ashes. Crusader armies remained only a short march away along the eastern Mediterranean, while rival Muslim rulers competed for power across Syria and Mesopotamia. Few moments in Cairo's history have looked more uncertain. Into this chaos stepped a man who had never expected to rule Egypt. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known in the West as Saladin. Born into a Kurdish military family, Saladin had arrived in Egypt as a young commander, serving his uncle Shirkuh. He wasn't a king. He wasn't the heir to a dynasty. And few could have imagined that this quiet, disciplined soldier would become one of history's most celebrated rulers. Yet within only a few years, Saladin abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, restored Sunni rule to Egypt, and founded the Ayyubid dynasty. But governing Egypt was only the beginning. Saladin understood that Cairo could never be secure while its defenses remained divided between separate cities and aging walls. If another Crusader army reached the Nile, Egypt's future would once again hang by a thread. So he embarked on one of the most ambitious construction projects in medieval history. High on the limestone hills overlooking the city, work began on an immense fortress unlike anything Egypt had seen before. The Citadel. Designed to dominate every approach to Cairo, its massive walls overlooked both the old city of Fustat and the growing Fatimid capital. Saladin also ordered new defensive walls intended to unite Cairo and Fustat into one enormous fortified metropolis, transforming scattered settlements into a single protected capital. His greatest victory came in 1187. After years of careful preparation, Saladin crushed the Crusader armies at the Battle of Hattin before recapturing Jerusalem, a triumph that echoed across Europe and the Islamic world alike. His reputation spread far beyond Egypt. Even many of his enemies admired his discipline, restraint, and military brilliance. Cairo became the beating heart of his empire. The city that only decades earlier had stood on the edge of collapse was now the political, military, and intellectual center of one of the most powerful states in the medieval world. The fortress Saladin began would guard Cairo for centuries, and the city's greatest age was only just beginning. Power in Cairo rarely changed hands peacefully. Following Saladin's death in 1193, the Ayyubid dynasty gradually weakened as rival princes competed for control. Into the growing instability stepped an unlikely new ruling class, the Mamluks. Most had begun life as enslaved boys purchased from the steppes of Central Asia or the Caucasus. Trained from childhood as elite cavalry soldiers, they were converted to Islam, educated in warfare, and taught absolute loyalty to their commanders. They were never meant to rule. Instead, they seized power themselves. In 1250, the Mamluks overthrew the last Ayyubid ruler and established a dynasty that would govern Egypt for more than 2.5 centuries. Under their rule, Cairo reached extraordinary heights. Magnificent mosques, madrasas, caravanserais, hospitals, and mausoleums transformed the skyline. Trade flowed through the city from West Africa, Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean. After the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258, Cairo became the undisputed political and intellectual heart of the Islamic world. But behind the beauty lay constant intrigue. Mamluk sultans were frequently overthrown, imprisoned, or assassinated by their own military rivals. Loyalty shifted overnight. Every palace corridor concealed another conspiracy. Then came one of the darkest days in Cairo's history. By 1811, the Ottoman Empire still claimed Egypt, but real authority rested with its ambitious governor, Muhammad Ali Pasha. Only one obstacle remained between him and complete control: the Mamluk elite. Muhammad Ali invited hundreds of their leading emirs to the citadel under the pretense of celebrating his son's departure to campaign in Arabia. The ceremony was lavish. The guests arrived in magnificent robes, mounted on richly decorated horses, believing they were attending a state procession. As they descended the citadel's narrow exit road, the gates slammed shut behind them. Soldiers appeared above the walls. Gunfire erupted from every side. Trapped inside the steep stone passage with nowhere to escape, the Mamluk leaders were cut down in a relentless hail of musket fire. Those who survived the first volleys found the exits blocked. Contemporary accounts describe horses collapsing beneath their riders as panic swept through the enclosed roadway. Only a handful are said to have escaped, including one legendary rider who supposedly leapt his horse over the citadel walls to freedom. Whether that dramatic escape happened exactly as later stories claim remains debated. The massacre did. In a single afternoon, centuries of Mamluk political power came to an end. Cairo had entered a new age, one no longer dominated by medieval sultans, but by a ruler determined to drag Egypt into the modern world. By the early 19th century, Cairo stood at the crossroads of two worlds. Its medieval markets still bustled beneath Mamluk minarets. Camel caravans continued to arrive from the Sahara and Arabia. Scholars still gathered inside Al-Azhar as they had for centuries. Yet beyond Egypt, the world was changing at extraordinary speed. European industry was accelerating. Modern armies were replacing medieval ones. Steam power, factories, and new technologies were transforming entire societies. Cairo risked being left behind. The man determined to prevent that was Muhammad Ali Pasha. History often remembers him as the founder of modern Egypt, and for good reason. But like many transformative rulers, he was full of contradictions. He was a reformer. He was also an autocrat. After eliminating the Mamluk elite, Muhammad Ali moved with remarkable speed. He reorganized the government, created one of the Middle East's first modern standing armies, and introduced compulsory military service on a scale Egypt had never seen before. European officers were hired to train his troops, while promising Egyptian students were sent abroad to study engineering, medicine, navigation, and military science. Industry followed. New textile mills, foundries, shipyards, and weapons factories appeared across Egypt. Vast irrigation projects expanded agricultural production, while cotton became the country's most valuable export, tying Egypt ever more closely to the growing global economy. Cairo became the center of it all. New schools opened. Hospitals expanded. Printing presses multiplied books and government documents faster than ever before. Administrative ministries grew around the old Islamic capital, giving the city a distinctly modern character while its medieval streets remained largely untouched. But modernization carried a heavy price. The state tightened its grip over almost every aspect of economic life. Farmers were compelled to grow government-selected crops. Heavy taxation funded military campaigns stretching from Sudan to Syria and even into Anatolia. Thousands of young men were drafted into the new army, many never returning home. Muhammad Ali wasn't simply rebuilding Egypt. He was reshaping it according to his own vision. When he died in 1849, the transformation was unmistakable. Cairo was no longer merely the surviving capital of medieval sultans. It was becoming the administrative heart of a modern state. The foundations had been laid. The next generation would dream even bigger, attempting to turn Cairo into nothing less than the Paris of the East. By the middle of the 19th century, Cairo was a city of two identities. One was ancient. Its maze-like medieval streets twisted between crowded bazaars, towering mosques, and neighborhoods that had grown organically for nearly 1,000 years. Donkeys, camels, merchants, and craftsmen filled alleyways barely wide enough for two people to pass. The other existed only in one man's imagination. Khedive Ismail, after traveling through Europe and witnessing the grand boulevards of Paris, Ismail became convinced that Egypt deserved a capital worthy of a modern world power. His ambition was simple. "My country is no longer in Africa," he reportedly declared. "We are now part of Europe." Like Napoleon III in France, Ismail commissioned sweeping urban renewal on an unprecedented scale. Entire districts west of the medieval city were carefully planned with broad, straight boulevards, elegant public squares, landscape gardens, gas lighting, modern sewage systems, and rows of European-style apartment buildings. Opera houses, ministries, bridges, and luxurious palaces rose across the expanding capital. For foreign visitors arriving after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, Cairo suddenly appeared transformed. It was dazzling. But beauty was only part of the story. Wide avenues made government buildings easier to reach, troops easier to deploy, and public demonstrations far more difficult to barricade than within the tangled medieval quarters. Administrative power shifted toward these new neighborhoods, allowing the government to govern a rapidly growing capital with greater efficiency and control. The modern city was also a political statement. Egypt intended to stand beside Europe's great capitals, not behind them. The cost, however, was staggering. Construction projects were financed through enormous foreign loans. Lavish spending far outpaced government revenues, pushing Egypt deep into debt. As repayments spiraled beyond control, British and French financial officials gradually assumed influence over Egypt's economy, limiting the very independence Ismail hoped to display. Meanwhile, the old city remained. Its medieval markets continued to pulse with life, while just beyond them elegant European boulevards stretched toward newly built suburbs. Two Cairos now existed side by side, one shaped by the Fatimids, Mamluks, and Ottomans, the other inspired by 19th-century Paris. That contrast still defines the city today. Every walk through modern Cairo is a journey between two civilizations, one preserved, one reinvented, and before long, both would find themselves under the shadow of a foreign empire. By the beginning of the 20th century, Cairo had become one of the largest and most important cities in Africa and the Middle East. But despite its grandeur, it was no longer fully in control of its own destiny. In 1882, Britain occupied Egypt, officially to restore order after a nationalist uprising. Although Egypt remained part of the Ottoman Empire on paper, and later became a British protectorate, the real decisions increasingly came from British officials. For decades, Cairo lived under foreign influence while nationalist movements steadily gathered strength beneath the surface. Then came the Second World War. Although Cairo was never occupied by Axis forces, the city stood dangerously close to one of the war's decisive fronts. In 1942, as German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel pushed across North Africa, many feared Cairo would fall next. British headquarters filled the city with soldiers, military vehicles, supply depots, and intelligence operations. Hotels became command centers. Streets echoed with foreign accents from every corner of the Allied world. Everything depended on one battle. At El Alamein, barely 100 kilometers west of Alexandria, Allied forces finally halted the German advance. Winston Churchill later declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Cairo had escaped, but peace did not solve its deeper problems. The gap between rich and poor widened. Foreign influence remained deeply unpopular. Corruption undermined confidence in the monarchy, while rapid population growth overwhelmed housing, transportation, and public services. Then, in July 1952, everything changed. A group of young military officers, known as the Free Officers Movement, overthrew King Farouk in a nearly bloodless revolution. Within 2 years, the monarchy had been abolished, ending nearly 2,000 years of kings, sultans, khedives, and foreign dynasties ruling Egypt. Soon one figure emerged above all others: Gamal Abdel Nasser. Under Nasser, Cairo became the political heart of Arab nationalism. Industries expanded. New residential districts spread across the desert. Bridges crossed the Nile. Universities grew. Factories multiplied. And millions of Egyptians migrated to the capital seeking opportunity. The city expanded faster than at any point in its long history. The medieval capital of caliphs and sultans had become a sprawling modern megacity. Ancient mosques still stood beneath the same sun, but around them, an entirely new Cairo was rising. Today, Cairo is home to well over 20 million people, making it one of the largest urban regions on Earth. It is a city where the ancient and the modern rarely stand apart. Glass skyscrapers rise within sight of medieval minarets. Metro trains race beneath neighborhoods older than many nations. The call to prayer still echoes across streets that now carry millions of cars every single day. Somewhere beneath the modern city lie the foundations of Roman fortresses, Fatimid palaces, Mamluk markets, and forgotten settlements that existed before Cairo even had a name. Few cities have survived so much. The fall of ancient Egypt, the collapse of Rome, foreign invasions, religious upheaval, years of famine, the burning of Fustat, the crusades, political assassinations, the Black Death, the rise and fall of sultans, Napoleon's invasion, British occupation, world wars, revolution, and yet, each time history seemed ready to erase Cairo, the city simply became something new. That's what makes Cairo, Cairo, not because it remained unchanged, but because it never stopped adapting. It absorbed civilizations instead of replacing them. Every empire left its mark, yet none completely defined it. The city you see today is not the product of one dynasty, one religion, or one ruler. It is the accumulated work of thousands of years of ordinary people rebuilding their lives after extraordinary events. It is noisy, crowded, chaotic, beautiful, frustrating, ancient, modern, a place where yesterday and tomorrow often exist on opposite sides of the same street. And perhaps that's why Cairo continues to fascinate the world. Because it doesn't simply preserve history. It lives inside it. If you enjoyed this journey through more than 5,000 years of one of humanity's greatest cities, thank you for spending your time here. There are many more remarkable places whose stories deserve to be told, not as isolated events, but as living histories that still shape the world around us today. Until next time, thanks for watching.